Hello and welcome. In this video, I wanted to do an update of the video where I talked about what you want to buy first for the forces of the Adeptus Mechanicus, as that video is rather old at this point and has become a little bit out of date, so I thought I would do an update video looking at what's changed and what units you should consider, as well as what things you should avoid early on in the perspective of the year of 2023. With that being said, let's dive into the background of the Adeptus Mechanicus a little bit. So what kind of playstyle does the Adeptus Mechanicus have? Well, the Adeptus Mechanicus have a very oppressive amount of firepower. Though they're not necessarily the best ranged army, they can really put out a devastating amount of damage within the first couple of turns and really put a lot of pain on an enemy opponent. They also do have some decent enough melee, however their melee tends to be a little fragile, and a lot of times it'll function like a glass cannon, going into an enemy unit, cleaning it out, and then being destroyed in return, though other times it can do rather well and survive for long enough to be even more impactful. In either case, the Adeptus Mechanicus do have a lot of optionality in terms of how they build a list now, whereas throughout 9th edition they kind of had a very specific build. I think there's a little more flexibility now in terms of how you would build a list. That being said, the other couple things you have to consider when looking at the Adeptus Mechanicus is that they're an army that really does rely on a lot of buff stacking, so you do have to consider if you enjoy that kind of style of play, as you can really make a single unit or a couple different units be incredibly powerful by applying different buffs from different units, characters, abilities, and stratagems to those units to really take them to the next level. As such, things like relics, stratagems, and character abilities are going to be a very important part of the army. However, that being said, you do have to keep in mind that as a result of that, as your different buff abilities and units get reduced in number, you're going to have a harder time fighting back as the game progresses, and you're going to be rather starved for command points. Not only that, but it does create a lot of bookkeeping, so when building out an Adeptus Mechanicus force, you definitely want to keep in mind that you want some efficient way of keeping track of the different buffs that you're putting on different units, considering that when you're distributing half a dozen or more buffs in your command phase, there is potential that you forget to distribute certain ones, and then you find out by the time it's too late, and the game has progressed to a point where it's hard to reverse it to where you could have utilized that ability to great effect. In any case, that's just something to think about when building an Adeptus Mechanicus force and asking yourself if you'll enjoy their style of play. The other thing that I'll give as a warning to any player looking to get into Adeptus Mechanicus, and this is a very unfortunate fact, is that the Adeptus Mechanicus are an incredibly expensive army in terms of dollar cost, and I would say they're probably one of the most expensive, if not the most expensive army, to really build out a full collection of, simply because of how low in points cost a lot of their units are. To put it into perspective, a single Iron Strider Ballistari costs a total of $60 before any discounts, and it's not uncommon to run them in a unit of 4 to 5, which is only about 300 points out of your 2,000 points, and considering each one comes individually, you're looking at a total cost of $240 to $300 for that unit of 4 or 5 of them. In fact, you would even run more of them if you could, but I think most people aren't going to spend that kind of money. But even with other choices, it can still be rather expensive, so just keep that in mind when building out an Adeptus Mechanicus army, that you'll be spending a lot of money, and it's not necessarily advised if you're on a very tight budget. However, I'll say the models are very beautiful and are incredibly fun to paint, so we'll say they're definitely worth the price tag, and if you live in the United States and are looking to pick up some of the Adeptus Mechanicus models at a discount to save yourself some money and make it feel a little less painful to build out that army, do visit the web store in the description down below or visit venturetradeco.com, where we sell all of these different kits at a discount from Games Workshop prices. We only ship within the United States, so do keep that in mind as there is a limitation in that regard. And if you do buy something, thank you very much, we really appreciate it. Now back to the regular content. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about the lore really quickly for the Adeptus Mechanicus. The Adeptus Mechanicus are an interesting faction as they are an Imperium faction, but they do have a lot of autonomy, considering that they manufacture all of the different weapons and technology for the Imperium. Unlike pretty much every other Imperium faction, they do have the ability to self-govern, as the other Imperium forces don't really want to pick a fight with all of their manufacturers and the vast armies that they control. And as a result of that, whereas the rest of the Imperium worships the Emperor, the Adeptus Mechanicus actually worship their own deity known as the Omnissiah or the Machine God. And while that sounds very heretical, many Adeptus Mechanicus view the Emperor as an embodiment of this Omnissiah, but who or what the Omnissiah really is isn't 100% clear within the lore. Some speculate it's actually the Emperor, and others consider it to be a Catan shard buried under Mars. That being said, the Adeptus Mechanicus are not necessarily a homogeneous faction, and they don't all obey Mars. For example, my favorite Forge World, that being of Triplex Fall, which isn't one of the ones found in the rules, is one that's a rather troublesome one, as it will oftentimes disobey the summons of Mars in terms of sending data and weapon schematics to the Forge World of Mars, and when they often do comply, they will send incomplete data and pretend like they don't know what happened when Mars tells them about how they discovered that the data that was sent over isn't actually complete or falsified in certain ways. And as a result of that, Mars sent an entire fleet to basically preside over Triplex Fall and keep watch over them. However, they found a way of utilizing this by basically taking this fleet on expeditions and using them as a sort of meat shield while they explore the planet, and as such, they actually once again pulled one over on Mars. I wouldn't say Triplex Fall is the only one that behaves in this way, as each Forge World has its own unique quirks and has its own way of viewing and doing things. In fact, there's so much variety that pretty much each Forge World has incredibly distinguishing markers and incredibly distinguishing lore. More so, I'll say this, while much of the Adeptus Mechanicus believes that human technology is superior and thinks any new innovation or alien technology is considered heresy, there are factions within the Adeptus Mechanicus, known as Xenorites, who pretty much stay in the shadows and do a lot of work and investigation within alien technology. This faction is very heavily found within the Stygies 8 Forge World. However, if they're asked about this, they'll vehemently deny any allegation of possessing or utilizing alien technology, as it is considered heresy by the wider Imperium. This really does show kind of the libertarian nature of the different Adeptus Mechanicus forces and how they believe in their own freedom and have the arms and artillery to defend that freedom even against the Imperium, which they are part of. And that's kind of an interesting faction within the game of 40k, as it kind of gives depth to what otherwise might feel like at times a very rigid Imperium. That being said, the Adeptus Mechanicus are not devoid of their own grimdark factors, as they'll do plenty of grimdark things, such as Agrippina taking a lot of Cadian refugees and turning them into servitors if they refuse to convert to the worship of the Onasiah. In addition to that, there is a story where a faction of the Adeptus Mechanicus conquer a Tau world, and they proceed to introduce the Tau population to a volcano by means of conveyor belt. That being said, you can't judge them too harshly, considering that the world of 40k is rife with these kind of things, and if you watched any of my other starter series, you'll know this is a pretty common factor across all factions who have their own fair share of different atrocities committed across the galaxy. And with that being said, let's talk about the price point of different models and which ones you should buy first and which ones you should avoid. We'll begin off with the Combat Patrol, as that's usually a very good starting point for anyone looking to build an army of any faction. The Adeptus Mechanicus Combat Patrol is actually a pretty good deal, even if some of the models are a little bit questionable. And in the past, I think I was a little more harsh on it, but considering the availability of previous start collecting kits and other such kits for the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Combat Patrol has definitely gone up in value. The Combat Patrol comes in at $150, and what you get inside of it is an engine seer for your HQ choice, which isn't particularly a great HQ choice, but does see occasional play as an additional HQ choice, and he would cost you $35 if bought individually. That value is a little bit generous, and I think really you should value him at less than that because he has been included in so many different starter kits that I wouldn't really ever pay $35 for him. But in any case, that's his value, so we'll count it as that for the purposes of this video. And after the engines here, you get a box of Skitarii, which gives you 10 different Skitarii that can be built into Rangers or Vanguard. This would cost you $50 if bought individually, and is a rather nice inclusion, as they're actually rather good, and unlike troop choices from other factions, they do have a very big place within different Adeptus Mechanicus forces, and at times have been the backbone of different Adeptus Mechanicus lists, giving them a very good place within different armies and a lot of value to any player looking to pick them up. The next inclusion after the Skitarii and the Engine Seer is a unit of 3 Cataphrons that can be built into Cataphron Breachers or Cataphron Destroyers. This would normally run you $60, and while Cataphrons weren't necessarily the best unit within the 9th edition so far, they definitely had times where they've been rather good, and they're actually a rather decent unit. I will say one thing, it's not super common to see Skitarii and Cataphrons within the same army, so it is a little bit awkward getting both of them in the same box, but at the same time, there are ways to run them together, and considering that the Cataphrons have improved significantly since they were released with the 9th edition, now that they have the core keyword and a better invulnerable save, I definitely think they're a little more interesting than they were when this box first came out. And finally, you get one additional inclusion, which is the Dune Crawler. The Dune Crawler individually would cost you $80, and while it hasn't seen a ton of play within the 9th edition, even though it's definitely seen some play in some army lists, it is a very beautiful model, and it's definitely one that attracted me to Adeptus Mechanicus, so having a cost-effective way of picking up a Dune Crawler is always a good thing, and I'm rather happy that it's included within a starter kit once again. So if everything was bought individually in this Combat Patrol, it would cost you a total of $225, so you're essentially saving $75. And if you go to AdventureTradeCo.com, you can pick it up for roughly a 15% discount from its price of $150, which gives you even more savings, and that's always a good thing, especially in such an expensive army. However, speaking of this being a rather expensive army, I will say this much, considering all the different points reductions that the different units in this Common Patrol saw throughout the 9th edition, especially in the latest chapter approved known as Arc of Omens, they'll probably only build out to about 400 points or less depending on what you build your different models into. Before the points reduction, it already had difficulty building out to 500 points, and that's really what makes Adeptus Mechanicus so expensive, is even if you get a lot of different models, they're still so low in points cost that you kind of have to buy so many of them just to kind of reach the same points that other armies reach much more easily. And as a result, to get to that 500 points, you're pretty much going to have to buy a combat patrol and an additional kit of some sort, which does drive up the dollar cost in comparison to other factions. But in any case, if I had to rate the combat patrol box, I would definitely say it's a rather decent value, and it's one that's actually pretty good, even if some of the inclusions are a little bit awkward and it's not the best value in the world. With that being said, let's look at other items you can buy first early on when building out Adeptus Mechanicus force. The first kit I would point to is the Iron Strider or Dragoon kit, which does cost a total of $60. However, the Iron Striders are definitely a staple within different Adeptus Mechanicus armies, and do provide you with some long-range heavy firepower that's very hard to find comparison for within other armies for their points cost and the amount of power they provide. In addition to that, the Dragoons have seen major buffs recently that make them incredibly cheap in points and very attractive. However, as I said before, because of the low points value of either of these options, it's definitely going to be rather expensive, but it's one of those things that the earlier you buy them, the happier you are because you're going to want them at some point, and they've always been rather solid and good options for the Adeptus Mechanicus. In terms of what else I would buy first, I would say something like the Sicaran Infiltrators or Sicaran Ruststalkers, which build out of the same kit and would cost you $55, is definitely a good choice because if you build them as Ruststalkers, they're rather good melee units, and if you build them as Infiltrators, they're decent melee units that have a little bit of range potential, and they have the ability to do some really interesting things with deployment. As such, the Infiltrators and Ruststalkers do definitely appear in a lot of different Adeptus Mechanicus lists, and they're one of those great melee units. They'll go into melee combat and definitely do a ton of damage for their points cost. A couple other kits I would recommend are the Taraxi Sterilizers, which would cost you a total of $60, and are pretty good units that can deep strike into the game, meaning that they can deploy into the game anywhere on the table. That's at least 9 inches away from any enemy model, and they have rather good flamer weapons, as well as other utility within the game, so they are a very fun unit to play with, and they're about on par with other options in terms of dollars to points. But I'll also say this, they're one of the more prettier models that I've seen within the game. And then the final standalone kit that I would recommend at this point is pretty much the Cast-on Robots. In the previous version of this video, I actually put them in the avoid category simply because of how points inefficient they were and what you were getting for the value. They are $80 for the box, but at the current points value and utility that they provide, as well as lower cost of the Cybernetica Datasmith, which is included within a box of 2 of them, they're definitely a decent choice, and they do roughly come out to about 200 points for that individual kit, so it is a somewhat cost-effective way of building out an army rather quickly, as they give you a decent points to dollar ratio, and they can actually be rather effective within the game at their current points level. So they're definitely a kit that saw a lot of improvement from the original iteration of this video when 9th edition first came out to today. As for anything else that I would say you can buy early on, if you find any of the old start collecting kits or any of the other bundle kits for a reasonable enough value that gives you a lot of different models at a discount, I'd definitely say that's something you should consider, especially considering that those kits are becoming harder and harder to find as they're no longer in production, and they might include some choices that you can't find in other bundle kits, which would allow you to reduce the cost that would cost to acquire some of those models, especially something like the start collecting kit if you can find it for $100 or less. Now that we've covered the kits that you should buy early on, let's take a look at some kits that you might want to consider but not necessarily buy when you're first starting out. Most of these kits are very playable, it's just that they have some issues that make them rather expensive for new players, or there's reasons you might want to avoid them until you kind of have a better idea of what you need specifically within your army. To start out with, the first kit that you might want to consider is the Cerberus Raider or Sulphur Hound kit, which would cost you a total of $60, and I think it's a rather good kit, and it's one that's very playable, but the problem is for that $60, you get a total of 3 models that best come out to about 60 points total, so it's definitely something that you want to be a little bit careful with if you're on a budget. I know that the Iron Strider is also roughly the same in terms of points to dollars, but what the Iron Strider offers is rather unique in nature, and it's a rather big model for what you're getting. The Cerberus units in comparison aren't quite as big, and they don't fit as much of a unique role within the army. In fact, you can pick up the Taraxi Sterilizers and get some of the same effect, even though the Sulphur Hounds might be a little better in certain situations. So it's definitely something you should consider, but just be aware that it's definitely a little bit of an expensive option within a rather expensive army. However, at some point you'll probably want to buy them, so do consider that as well, and I would say this is one of those units that can cross between things you definitely want to buy and things you might want to avoid. So think about these 3 categories of sort of a Venn diagram where certain things will overlap in terms of how much you want to buy them. Anyway, the next kits I would say to maybe consider buying or maybe consider avoiding are things like the basic Skitarii boxes and the Cataphron kit, and the reason for this being is while the Skitarii and Cataphrons are reasonably decent and you want them in a rather large number, you do have to consider if you'd want to buy something like the Common Patrol where you get those same units at a bit of a discount, or if you can find some of the old Start Collecting boxes or some of the other bundle boxes which can give you a lot of those units at a discount as they're included in pretty much in all of the different bundles, whether it's Start Collecting, Common Patrol, or the various Christmas bundles that have been released over time. I will say this much though, you also want to consider them at times because they're both rather good and there are going to be situations where you want a bunch of Skitarii but you don't necessarily want the Cataphrons included within the Common Patrol, so you might want to consider one of these over the other, and they're not the worst value in the world, so it's definitely something you should think about, but it's one of those things where you can maybe get a little bit of a better deal if you buy them in other formats. That being said, you definitely want a lot of Skitarii as currently you benefit from having 15 to 20 of them within a unit for the different stratagems, as well as having additional ones for potential support and objective gathering. They're definitely a very good and powerful troop choice, and sometimes you'll be running as many as 60 different Skitarii or a bunch of different Cataphrons, so there's definitely reasons where you would buy individual kits of them as opposed to some of the bundles. But that being said, just keep in mind that you can get them in a lot of different bundles, so think about getting those bundles first, and then additional Skitarii later, once you have a better idea of how your army is shaping out and what you're going to be playing. And finally, the last unit that you might want to consider buying is Belisarius Call, who would cost a total of $60. The reason I bring up Belisarius Call, whereas before he was in the avoid category, is because he's recently seen a rather big points cost reduction, and as a result of that he's become significantly better, as well as the things like the Cataphrons, receiving the core keyword, allowing him to better interact with them, so I definitely think he's gone a lot better and he's a lot more playable, but at the same time, I'm a little bit skeptical about how good he's going to be, as he's still rather expensive, and if you're just building out a 500 point army, I'd definitely say wait until you're ready to build out to 1,000 or more points. In either case, if you really like Belisarius Call or his model, he's definitely something you can consider now, whereas before he was definitely a little bit too weak to really see any play. Now he actually has some potential, and he might be an interesting contribution if you want to play him within one of your armies. And finally we come to the last section, which is things you should avoid buying early on. The first of the kits we're going to mention is one that you might want to consider, but I think it's one you can kind of avoid as well. That being the Scorpius tank, which was one of those items that you wanted early on because it was so good. However, different universal changes and different nerfs to it over the course of the 9th edition have definitely hurt it as a unit. However, I'll say this much, recently it saw a rather big points reduction, which definitely makes it a lot better and a lot more interesting. As such, you might want to consider buying it, but I still think it's one of those things that you should wait a little bit before buying, considering it's a total of $80 and some of the changes still hurt his playability rather heavily. That being said, if you can find one of the old Start Collecting boxes that include the Scorpius tank, and you can find it for $100 or less, it's definitely an interesting pickup, and it's definitely one that I would say you should probably consider, considering they're not making those anymore. As such, I would say this is definitely one of those units that you can avoid early on, or you can consider, as it does have enough flexibility that you can find places for it within an army list, but it's not something that's going to be a centerpiece of your army. The next models you should avoid are things that you can kind of convert out of basic Skitarii models such as the Skitarii Marshal or the Techno-Archaeologist, as you're pretty much going to be able to convert these out of things like the basic Skitarii or things like additional engine seers if you buy multiple Common Patrol boxes, and as such it's pretty easy to save about $34 instead of buying these individually. That being said, if you really like the models and you really want to buy them, there's nothing wrong with buying them, as they're rather nice models and they're definitely something you can add to your collection. It's just that if you're trying to save some money, there's something you can build out of other units for the time being, and then eventually buy them if you still want them in the future. And now we come to a model that was in the category of things you should buy early on within the original video, and in part inspired me to make this update video, and that being the Archaeopter. The Archaeopter has seen a rather big hit in terms of points increases, and in addition to that, recent universal changes have definitely hurt the Fusilier Bomber in a rather significant way, and have definitely made it a lot more difficult to use the other options for this flyer as well. And considering that this model would cost you $110 without any discounts, it's definitely something that's a bit rough to buy early on, but once again, if you really enjoy the model, and you don't mind running it as a Stratoraptor gunship, it can definitely be a fun model to play around with, but especially if you're kind of just starting out, I'd say just hold off on this model until they improve on some of the flyer rules, as right now it's going to be a rather weak model, even though it's one of the better models when the 9th edition codex came out. Unfortunately, that's just something that happens with different models over time, and that's why I always tell people you should start collecting early on, as once you get a good collection of models, it becomes rather easy to adapt to different points changes instead of you buying a bunch of models and then trying to build them out all at once, and realizing that the rules have been updated once again, and some of your army isn't as good as you first thought it was. In any case, that's kind of the models I would avoid, and there's one other thing that I would say you should definitely avoid, and that's any of the supplementary codex books, such as the Warzone Caradon books, whether that's number 1 or number 2, because those have rotated out, and they're no longer valid, so things like the Skitarii Veteran Cohort and the Skitarii Defense Cohort are no longer valid, neither are the additional Metallica rules for the Warzone Caradon. And that's a little sad, because that really hurts the Forge World of Metallica, and it kinda doesn't have the tools that it once did. So when you do watch the video about the Metallica Forge World, do keep in mind that anything from the Warzone Caradon is no longer valid for that Forge World. And as such, this means that these books are pretty much useless to you, except for collector's value. So don't pick those up unless you really want them just for your collection. In any case, that pretty much wraps up everything you should consider buying and everything you should avoid early on, as well as a bit about the Admech themselves and what kind of lore and playstyle they have. And with that being said, remember, if you're looking for some models at a bit of a discount, visit venturetradeco.com, link available in the description down below. And as always, thank you for watching, have a great day, see you next time, bye.